This is mini lecture 4B, and we will be covering about half of chapter 5 on medical math. You've been practicing medical math throughout this semester, however, in the quizzes in each unit. Math is really important in healthcare, and here are a few examples for when and where it's used. I would say every healthcare professional uses math of some type. What I think is important to keep in mind is the math that's used is pretty basic level math. So it's not higher level calculus or trigonometry in most cases. We're talking about basic math, and that's what we'll be reviewing in this chapter. What changes is that it needs to be 100% accurate, because errors in math can have dire consequences. So you should always double check your calculations. You should always ask for help if you need it. A lot of students come to college with what's called math anxiety. It's very, very common, but it does get in the way of becoming competent in this basic medical math. Now, the good news is it can be overcome because it's really based upon false beliefs. And this is one of the false beliefs. If a person currently has problems with math, it can be assumed that it would always be a problem. That's absolutely false. Math anxiety is a learned behavior and can be overcome. Very often I talk to students, and at some point in your math education, you had a really difficult experience, and you were convinced, unfortunately, at times by an adult, that you could not learn math. And that is false, and that's where we should begin. These are the basic calculations that you most often use in medical math. Okay, so this textbook does cover the basic calculations and how to do them. You can practice with YouTube videos, you can practice with old math textbooks. I will not go into lots of detail as we cover these slides on the basics, but a few, okay? These are the whole numbers. They don't have fractions or decimals. Decimals are expressed as parts of a number in units of 10, such as tenths, hundredths, etc. And the placement values are really, really important. So here is a number line showing you the placement values based on where that number appears in relationship to the decimal point. So if you had a 2 at the units spot, that's the unit. If a 2 was one spot to the left here, that's the tens. So you see it goes units, tens, hundredths, to the right of the decimal point, tenths, hundredths, thousandths. This may be helpful. Decimals can be added, subtracted, multiplied, and divided, and you can look this up. I've linked in a lot of Khan Academy videos to your MedMath and MedTerm quizzes, but you can find this information all over the internet, and the text does a pretty good job of reviewing too. So to prevent errors, we only use the 0 before the decimal point, kind of as a placeholder, not after. So yes, you would write 0.5, okay, for 5 tenths, but you would not write 5.0 for 5, okay? You don't use that trailing 0. So the text reviews how to multiply with decimals, and this is a pretty nice little graphic that shows you the steps that you would use. And as far as adding decimals, and subtracting decimals, it's very important to line things up correctly. So be sure to review that as well. You may wonder why in a world of calculators and apps we really need to do this. You do need to have an understanding of how to do the math for a couple of reasons in case you ever don't have a calculator or computer at the ready, okay? Or to be able to do mental math to kind of make sure your computer calculation is accurate. Okay, so here's multiplying decimals and dividing decimals, which I always think is the most difficult one. Maybe not difficult as much as time consuming. Fractions represent parts of a whole, so they're written as the number of parts over the total number of parts, such as 1/2. The numerator is the top number, the denominator is the bottom number. And there you see in the kind of pie form what these different fractions represent. Okay, so that's 3/10, 3 out of 10. Adding fractions is a little bit more complex because what you need to do is find a common denominator, okay, before you can add the fractions. Subtracting fractions, you'd have to be able to do the same thing. Multiplying fractions, you don't. Okay, multiplying fractions, you line them up and multiply. And dividing fractions is kind of neat. When you divide a fraction, you just flip the second fraction over and then operate as multiplication. In an improper fraction, the numerator is larger than the denominator, so reducing fractions is finding a number that divides evenly into both the numerator and the denominator. So when you look at 3/6, that can be reduced to 1/2. It's the same thing. So you can 3 divided by 3 is 1. 6 divided by 3 is 2. So before I move on any further, I did want to mention that we do have a learning lab and it's virtual right now, and we do have math tutors. Math tutors not only during the week, kind of the on hours, but we also have math tutors on off hours as well. So be sure to utilize those tutoring services. There is a link to that in your Canvas course. Okay, so percentages. Percentages are when you express a whole or a part of a whole, and the whole is 100%. So 85% is 85 parts of 100, 26%, 26 parts of 100. And you can convert the percent to a decimal and then perform the calculation. So here is an example of converting decimals to fractions. Okay. Decimals to percentages. This is pretty tricky. You do have to be careful when you're converting decimals to percentages. 5.275. That's 5 whole. Okay, 500%. So you need to keep that in mind. You multiply by 100 to get the percentage. Fractions to decimals is really easy. You just divide and then you get the decimal. The leading 0 is in there to draw your attention to the decimal so you don't make an error. Converting fractions to percentages, let's look at that. You end up with a decimal first, and to go from decimal to percentage, remember you multiply by 100. Converting percentages to decimals, you would think you would do the opposite, right? So you would divide by 100. 125.5% is the same as 1.2 0.255. So these are some basic math that you should be able to do. Percentages to fractions, 5% you know is 5 out of 100. And then you reduce that, divide both the numerator and the denominator by 5, and you get 1 out of 25. You know what? This is a mistake here. I'm staring at this. This is an error, so I'm going to have to fix this. If you caught it while I was talking because I was thinking that doesn't make sense, it should be 1 out of 20, right? 5%. 1 out of 20 because 5 goes into 5 once, 5 goes into 100 20 times. I'm going to fix that. Ratios show the relationships between numbers or like values. I don't think I have test questions on ratios, but they're very often used to express the strength of solutions. 3 to 1, 3 parts water to 1 part vinegar. Are these all the same? 3/4, 75%, and 0.75. And let's look. 3/4 is 75%. 75 divided by 100, yes, they are all the same. Rounding numbers, you change the number to the nearest 10, 100,000, whatever is requested of you. And it's used because it's more easily kind of to do a quick calculation. Remember the rule: 4 or less, let it rest; 5 or more, let it soar. So if you are going to round 372 to hundreds, it would be 400. 317, 300. Okay. Rounding decimals, you need to know to the nearest what? So to the nearest tenth would be that place. So you would look to the right. Okay, 4 or less, let it rest, 7.8. Nearest hundredth, okay, we look here. Then look to the right, 4 or less, let it rest. Okay, nearest thousandth. Okay, all of them are let it rest. What is 2.346 rounded to the nearest tenth? Let's see. 2, 2.3, 2.35. Which one? So this is the tenth, and we're going to round to that place. So it would be 2.3.